I didn't go to Redgate because I was brave. I went because my landlord wouldn't take apologies for rent, and because a uniform that smells like starch and metal still looks better than panic on a face. If you're here for the part where I say I was called, you'll be waiting a while. The only call I answered was a phone that said night shift pays an extra $1. I told myself I could do anything for a month. I told myself fear gets smaller the longer you stare at it. I told myself a lot of things that turned out not to be true. The prison sits on a low clay hill that looks unfinished, like the county ran out of money one afternoon and left a building behind as an excuse. The fences were razor wire, the color of old nickels, and the brick is the kind that holds onto weather even after the storm leaves. On the night I started, rain came sideways, turning the coils into humming strings. The bus dropped me at the Sally Port, and a guard behind glass slid a temporary badge across without looking up. When I said East Wing, he looked past me to the rain, like the weather had an opinion that mattered more than mine. He buzzed me through without a smile and told me nothing I'd remember later, which is a kind of kindness you learn to appreciate in places like that. Control smelled like old paper and new coffee and a clock that was always right in the way you hate. Captain Miller briefed me standing up, as if chairs were for men who had finished their mistakes. Rounds every 15, he said with a voice that didn't need volume to be loud. Don't linger. Don't talk unless you have to. Keep your radio on 2. If 2 dies, try 7. If 7 dies, come back. Do not improvise. He pushed a black binder toward me with a thumb that looked like it had pushed a lot of things for a lot of years. Special notes are in the right column. Read with your eyes and your memory. The binder's pages were gray with bad printer ink and worse lighting. EO1. Shot caller. Manipulative. Watch his staff eyes. EO4. Self-harm risk. Sings between 3 o'clock to 3:30 a.m. Do not reward with conversation. 11. Religious preoccupation. Responds to chaplain. When I reached E13, my eyes stopped like they'd hit a wall I couldn't see. No photo. No name. Just one sentence that felt like a quiet pull tight. Do not engage unless necessary. It was the calm of it that made me sweat. Calm like a man in a suit who already knows your answer. Who's in 13? I asked, and Miller studied me, just long enough to make the lights hum louder. You won't need to engage, he said, sliding me a brass key too ugly to be standard. It was warm from his hand. He mentioned Hensley called in and I'd be covering alone. I said I was supposed to shadow, he said, consider it the shortest shadow in history, and told me not to put my fingers in slots, not to lean on doors, not to be a hero. I nodded like a man who hadn't heard anything he didn't want to. The corridor to east got narrower the deeper we went, as if the building wanted me smaller. Rain in the ductwork sounded like a distant crowd. At the wing door, umbled the brass key, and the locking bar dropped with a sound that felt like a decision being made without me. The air on the tier had a weight, disinfectant sharpened by metal, and something sweet that didn't belong. The floor looked scrubbed without ever being clean. In old places, shine is just a kind of memory pretending to be work. Officer on the tier, I said, because the handbook told me to, and because saying a thing out loud gives the place a chance to decide if you belong. My voice came back to me thinner than it went out. East is a straight concrete throat with 12 doors on each side and a utility corridor teeing off at the end like a mouth opening for the doctor. Slots at knee height, 3 knuckles high, cameras at both ends and dead center. Watching like tired eyes. If you want weather, you have to carry it in on your boots. First round is all habit until it isn't. You listen before you look. Stand hinge side so your shadow doesn't sell you out. Use the mirror on a stick if you don't like surprises. Announce, count, note, move. Adio to a pair of eyes watched me from under a bunk, blinking the way people blink when they're trying to remember how. Adio 5 someone whispered a prayer you could mistake for a song if you needed it to be. Yo 6S inmate had an anchor tattoo on his throat and asked if I had a sister like the question was a door he already had a key for. E11 breathed Chaplin into the seam as if the word itself might be a latch. I didn't answer, not because I'm strong, but because I'm obedient. At E13 I felt the cold before I read the number plate. Not a breeze east doesn't do breezes but a temperature that had its own plan. The slot was closed. Silence on the other side was a kind of sound. I marked the margin in the binder B13 cold pocket, check vent, because writing a thing makes the world pretend to cooperate, and I kept going because feet are the first part of you that forgets fear needs permission. At the end of the tire, E18 was just another door until it wasn't. 2 padlocks hung above the deadbolt, not prison issue. Old, round-bodied, the kind they sell at small hardware stores that smell like rope and winter. Dust crescents sat under their chins where fingers hadn't touched in a while, and a chalk X floated over the number plate like a tilted halo. The smell at the hinge wasn't bleach or sweat. It was the damp of concrete that never sees sun. I put my shoulder to the opposite wall and listened to nothing for as long as I could, which turned out to be shorter than I wanted. Between rounds, I sat at the Glaston station, unwrapped a meatloaf sandwich from the diner down on Route 9, and learned how time really works at Redgate. The fluorescence hiccuped every 9 minutes. The vents breathed like someone timing me. My radio onto gave me static. On 7 it gave me a hiss that sounded like wind in an empty bottle. The rain outside slowed to a steady hiss on concrete, and the building listened to it like an old song. I told myself I was fine. I told myself night gets easier once you see how it's built. I told myself not all buildings have opinions. Second round, officer on the tire. EO1 performed Sleep with Rage whittled down under the blanket. EO4 didn't sing. EO9 asked what day it was, and when I said Tuesday, he told the ceiling it wasn't. At E13 the slot was open, a thin black idea in the middle of the door. I stopped 3 feet back. 3 feet is respect. 2 feet is trouble. Close your slot, I said, and what came out wasn't so much a whisper as a thought that had decided it deserved a voice. Calm, male, close enough to be a breath. You're not supposed to be here tonight. My name isn't large on my badge. My schedule in public. Hensley had called out an hour before I walked in. I said close your slot again because procedure is a small raft on a wide river and it's better to keep your feet under you. Something scraped inside, paper against metal, and a folded scrap slid through and landed by my boot. Yellow legal pad, damp at the edges, smelling like pennies. I opened it because I was always going to open it. 3 words printed heavy enough to chew the lines. Don't open 18. If you've ever felt a building lean closer when you read something, you know the weight that settled in my palm. I tucked the note into my chest pocket, the paper warming against a heartbeat I wanted quieter, and kept moving because legs are good at pretending they have no stake in a decision. At E18 the padlock looked exactly the same and not at all. I told myself I was wrong, that light lies and memory double exposes. I put a tiny dot of ink under the right-hand lock, a private secret between me and the door. If the dot moved before the next round, I'd go back and write a sentence that would change the shape of my night. I didn't make it to the next round before the lights died. They didn't snap off, they were taken, like a breath held too long. My world shrank to the circle of my flashlight and all the places I wished I'd never stood. Procedure says do not run. Procedure says announce. Procedure says check the panel past D18, which is the kind of joke the world tells with a straight face. Officer on the tier, I said, and the sound slid along concrete like a small animal looking for a hole. The beam cut a path through gray to more gray. Doors, numbers, drain holes with little white rectangles of shredded towel crushed into them. The chalk X over E18's plate looked wider than it had before. The padlocks were gone, not hanging. Not dropped, gone. The door set open the width of 2 fingers, and the air from inside was the kind of cold that wasn't really temperature. It was an idea. Somewhere behind me, a man drew in breath like a swimmer breaking water, and then no one breathed at all. I told myself a lie so my knees would work. The lie was that I couldn't see the locks because my light was too bright. I dropped to a knee, swept the beam. The floor was a map of scuffs and hairline cracks and a loop of someone's sleeve thread ground into dust. No brass, no weight, no excuse. The second lie was worse, that I still had a choice. I put my palm on the paint-worn edge and pushed. The door gave like a thought already decided. I didn't cross. I sent the light instead. Empty. Not no bed empty or no toilet empty. Empty like a new word, for poured concrete walls finished wrong, to smooth. No bolt holes where anything had been. A dark stain in the middle of the floor, shaped like an island my father once traced on a map when I was 7, and he wanted to show me where he'd been when he was 19. The air smelled like damp stone folded over something older that had been trying to leave for a long time. And then the corner thickened. It didn't scrape. It didn't make the sound a foot makes. It altered how the light moved. The shadow became a place, and then a shape stepped out of a space that hadn't existed a second earlier. It was a man built from measurements a degree off, too tall by an inch here, too narrow at the shoulders by an inch there, joints that learned as they used themselves. My first thought was escapee. My second thought was no, because the face it brought with it had mine on it. Not exactly. Your own face is a country you think you know until you see a forgery. The eyes were one color where there should have been rings, pupils drinking too much light. The mouth had a smile I've never used, tilted wrong. The skin carried the shades you get when every paint on the palette gets involved and the result refuses a name. Close the door, it said, and my voice came back to me, wearing a second voice inside it, like a twin you never wanted sharing your mouth. If you want to know who you are, listen to what you do when something wears your voice and gives you instructions. I closed the door, slow, because fast is begging. The seam met the jamb with a small click I still hear sometimes when I check my locks at night. My hand reached for the padlocks because my hand wanted to hold a lie. The hasps were empty. Above the left, a smear of dust where my dot wasn't, except maybe it had always been there, except maybe I'd never had a pen. The lights came back like morning in cheap curtains, reluctant and filmy. The ballast in fixture 3 buzzed its grievance. The rain remembered its job. I keyed my radio, and static held my throat. East to control, I said, and a voice came through thick as if it had a mouthful of water. Troll, read you. Temporary power loss, I said. Panel check needed. 18's door ajar. Interior non-standard. Possible tampering. Advise. Maybe it was copy that came back. Maybe it was a breath pretending to be a word. Hold position. I took the station phone because old plastic doesn't lie like radio does. Miller answered like he was already on his feet. I told him about the locks that weren't there and the door that wouldn't admit it liked being open. I told him about the smell of stone. I told him about the note from 13 because that part felt like something you can say without altering the shape of a room. I did not tell him the door had used my voice. I did not tell him my face had been waiting inside. He told me not to approach 18 and not to engage 13 and that Ortiz was on his way. The line didn't disconnect so much as die. Writing is how you build a net under a high wire. So I wrote. Power glitch earlier. Full outage at 01. Radio intermittent. E13 initiated contact. Slip note. Don't open 18. E18 padlocks absent. Door ajar. Interior non-compliant. Odor damp mineral. Advise maintenance. I didn't write the parts that would live in my mouth if I put them on paper. My hand wrote to small, a thing it does when it's trying to outrun a thought. When Ortiz arrived, the rain was on his pants up to the knees, and his hair lay flat like someone had smoothed it with a wet palm. 19 years, his patch said, and his eyes carried the kind of calm you learn by stacking alarms until they look like furniture. You called about 18, he said, and I nodded because words didn't seem like currency that would spend well. And 13, I said. You got a note. I tapped my chest pocket. Don't open 18. He nodded the way men nod when they're confirming math. How many locks? 2. How old? He asked. Older than me, I said. Older than everybody. We walked the tire together, and the floor got less hungry. That's what it feels like when company makes space for you in a place that doesn't like to share. At E13, he didn't slow, but his eyes moved across the seam like a thumb checking the edge of paper for the place it will tear. At E18, he stopped. The padlocks are not present in any universe where language is useful. He didn't bend to look for them. He pressed his palm to the door and leaned his head to the seam like it might whisper if he let it. I'm going to close you now, he said in a voice you use for a child with a fever. Whatever's in, stays. Whatever's out, mind your manners. He put a shoulder to the metal, and the door settled like a lung that had remembered how to breathe. From his belt, he drew a key, hadn't seen before, longer, older, with a shaft like a nail you find in a farmhouse beam and dainty pull because the house knows more about staying up than you do. He touched it to the empty hasp where no chain hung, and there was a sound of chain settling. He breathed once through his nose, and every hair on my arms remembered their job. You wrote it? He asked without looking away, and I said yes and no, and I didn't know which answer landed. Hungry? He asked, and I realized I was, and I hated knowing it. We ate a burrito from the bottom drawer of the station cabinet like it was contraband hope. He let me ask before he answered. What is 18? It depends. Log version says maintenance relic, sealed space from an old retrofit, non-compliant, out of rotation, staff not to engage, maintenance to address when funding appears, which it won't. Story version says Redgate used to have a spoke for death row, and when the law changed, the spoke got folded into East. The room they didn't know what to do with wasn't a cell. It was Death Watch, the last night place where men and attention learn each other in a way that makes the air heavy. You can wall that up, he said, but it doesn't go away. It just stops asking permission to be itself. Why the padlocks? A lock is a prayer you can touch, he said. Sometimes touching is the only relief the hand believes in. We did a round together. At EO, for the singing that hadn't shown up earlier arrived late and thin, like a hymn trying to remember its words. At EO, 7 someone said my name and then my sister's, and asked me to tell her not to stand by windows in a thunderstorm. 5 years back, her first husband died with glass in his chest under a sky that smiled too hard. I don't believe in omens. I believe in buildings that overhear us and like to practice tricks. At E13, Ortiz tapped the door twice, knuckle light, and said appreciated to no one. From inside came a slow, single knock, like a man who hasn't used his hand in a while and doesn't want to scare it off. Back at the station, I asked the question I didn't want to hear out loud, and Ortiz answered anyway. You'll get used to hearing yourself here, he said. You won't like every place your voice comes from. At 3:45 the monitors glitched, and every camera showed the same thing for a fraction of a fraction. The corridor without doors, a long blank throat, with steps leading down into a quiet that isn't sound so much as pressure. Ortiz reached out without looking and pulled the power strip, blacking it all out and then pushing it back in so the doors could return and pretend they never left. We didn't speak, because sometimes silence deserves to stand upright for a minute before you ask it to move. I didn't make it to shift change. I said I'm done like a man setting down a tool, and Ortiz nodded like I'd confirmed the name of a street. Write what you can, he said, and I did. The version that doesn't make rooms decide to listen harder. Miller read it like he was sorting socks, initialed a margin, slid it into a tray, and told me I'd need my badge to clock out. He didn't ask why my hands were shaking. He didn't ask where my voice had been. Questions are a currency Redgate doesn't pay out often. I didn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with a grease bag from the diner and learned how long a paper sack can hold your attention when it's the only thing in the room that doesn't want anything from you. Twice I went to the bathroom to check the mirror. It behaved. A week later it didn't. My reflection lagged a heartbeat behind me and then caught up like a bad video call, and I laughed in the exact tone men used to swallow screams without chewing. If you've ever watched your own face decide it doesn't belong to you for a second, tell me what you did next. I'm not the only one who wants to know. If the story made sense here, I'd tell you I never went back. But people are liars about themselves, and I told everyone it was rent when it was curiosity. Shift 2. Radio mostly good. Light sullen, but obedient. EO for saying at 3:29 sharp. A high thread that made the skin behind my ears remember they had work. E13 kept his slot closed and let the cold do his talking. E18's padlocks were back. They weren't the same. The brand stamp sat different, and the dust crescent under the left had a different curve, and I drew a dot under the right to make the universe answer a small question. On the next round my dot was gone and a dot I didn't draw was there. I stopped drawing dots. The game didn't stop when I put the pen away. It just learned new rules. Shift 3. EO7 said my father's name and told me to tell him he could stop sanding that board. When I was 8, my father spent nights in the garage smoothing the same 2x4 until it was a suggestion of itself. He called it practice. He never built anything. He died last year with his hands still believing they had a job left. I put my palm on EO7's door and pressed the cold into my skin until I remembered that not every memory deserves the present tense. Shift 4. I handed Miller my badge and keys and said I am done, without asking for a transfer or a week to think. Write it, he said. Write what you can read out loud. What happens to 18? I asked, because I wanted to hear him say the wrong thing. 18 keeps happening, he said, and the clock agreed with him like a man liking the sound of his own voice. 2 weeks later, the sky pretended it wouldn't rain, and I parked at the diner down the hill to see if looking would make something better. Ortiz tapped my passenger window like he'd been practicing that exact sound for years, slid in like the seat remembered him, and took the second burrito without asking or apologizing. We ate with the windows down and listened to the town do its human business, a skateboard knocking lines out of cracked concrete, an old cough that sounded like it wanted to be younger, laughter pulled too wide, Redgate breath on the hill like it had finally learned what its lungs were for. 18, I asked. Still there, he said. Locks are new and old at once. 13. Still a man who knows when not to speak. That's his talent, Ortiz said, smoothing a napkin on his knee like a map. He knows the size of silence and how to fit inside it without making it break. Say the thing you don't write, I said, and he did. It wasn't that 18 wanted open or closed, he said. It wanted decided. People put locks and chalk and notes and stories with endings on it like favors. 18 didn't want an end. It wanted a man to stand there and choose. Close, open, leave, stay. It would take any of those and build a place out of it. And my voice, I asked, because a splinter only stops hurting once you pull it through. It was trying you on, he said, like a coat on a hook. Looked good, didn't look like you. If you don't want to wear it, don't go where it hangs. We didn't shake hands. We nodded like men who had agreed on the name of a street. He left by the back door, I left by the front. Since then I've made small rituals that aren't superstition so much as hygiene. 2 cups of coffee some mornings, one for me and one for the part of the house that thinks it lives here. I let the second go cold and pour it out like a confession. At night, I touch my front door and say we reclosing you now in a voice I hope always belongs to me. Sometimes, at 3 a.m., there's a knock slow enough to be polite. Sometimes my phone wakes with no notification because Light likes to practice. Sometimes I catch my reflection a beat behind in the hall at dusk, and I say my name before it can, and the echo does what it's told. If you re-still with me if you rode the rain in the ductwork and the breath in the vents and the radio pretending to be a throat for something that doesn't need one tell me what you would ve done. Drop a stay or leave if you were standing where I stood, with 2 padlocks in your memory and none in your hand, your own mouth telling you to close a door someone else decided to open. Would you push? Would you walk? Would you say your name into the seam and wait for the person wearing you to say it back? I left. I won't pretend I didn't. I left because something borrowed my voice and tried my face on, and I decided courage sometimes looks like knowing which rooms you will not apply to for approval. I left because there's a difference between brave and hungry, and E18 is a door that begs you to call hunger a virtue. I left because I wanted sleep and mornings and the sound a city makes when it forgets to be afraid. The note still lives in my drawer, the paper softer from all the times my thumbs have told it the same story. Don't open 18, it reads like a rule, it feels like a diagnosis. There are doors you open because you think there's light behind them. There are doors you don't because that light is a kind of appetite. 18 is the second kind. Red Gate taught me the difference. Red Gate taught me I don't have to eat everything offered. Red Gate taught me some rooms are alive the way stories are alive, and if you give them your name, they keep it forever. On some afternoons, when the river outside my new apartment turns its surface to mirror an hour before sundown, I catch myself remembering the corridor on the monitors with no doors and wonder if that's what rooms see when they dream themselves without us. I think about the first round and the cold seam of 13 and the words in my pocket warming against my chest. I think about Ortiz saying a lock is a prayer you can touch and realizing that most prayers are just hands trying to forgive themselves. I think about the way the chalk X over 18 always looks slightly wrong, like it was drawn left-handed by a right-handed man who didn't want the line straight because straight looks too much like certainty. There was a night after I quit when I woke to the exact sound of the station phone ringing, a heavy thing with a voice you can't ignore. I got out of bed and stood in the hallway listening to my apartment not make that noise. Silence is rarely empty once you teach yourself how to hear it. It was the same night I found the meatloaf napkin in a jacket I'd hung by the door and forgotten to clean out. It had taken the shape of my thigh. I unfolded it and there was a greased circle where the burrito would have sat if it had learned how to leave a mark. The napkin didn't smell like anything. I put it in the trash and said, "We're closing you now," to nobody, and nobody did as it was told. I ran into Miller at the grocery store once, months after I left. He was buying coffee and dish soap and a lottery ticket, and he looked the way men look when they've worked long enough that off-duty is just the half that happens without a uniform. He nodded like we were passing each other in a corridor where people pretend there are NT cameras. He didn't ask how I was sleeping. I didn't ask if 13 had kept his slot closed. We each let the other keep his room. I haven't told you everything. That's not because there's more you need to know to believe me. It's because there are parts of a night that shouldn't be carried alone, and the way you keep them from breaking you is to leave them in a place that knows how to hold. I left some of it in the chalk dust over a brass number. I left some of it in the dent my shoulder made in a cinder block wall when I needed something that didn't move. I left some of it in a burrito wrapper and a bottom drawer and a key that fit a lock that wasn't there. What I kept is enough to say what I need to say. If you've made it to this last line, tell me, did I make the wrong choice? Would you have stayed? Or would you have closed it the way I did? Softly, like a promise, like a prayer you can touch, and walked away with your own voice still in your mouth.